And friends, our scripture lesson this week is taken from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Well, friends, I want to talk to you about one of the most serious sins in our society today. Apparently, that is the sin of cutting in line. I mean, it's one of the things that if you do it, people seem to almost always speak up about it. I mean, there are so many things people can do. I mean, they can observe someone being rude to a cashier. They can observe all kinds of other things. But cut in line, and you are almost certainly going to hear about it from someone. Now, I think it's kind of interesting that people get so offended by such a simple act. I mean, when do you not mind? I mean, when do you allow it? Do you just let it happen? Someone cuts in front and you just sort of say, "Okay, you know what? I'm just going to let it go." It's an interesting question because it's actually something that surfaces in the way our passage is structured today. See, our passage is kind of interesting because it's a story within a story. And it begins with the story of an important person. He's a leader of the synagogue, coming to Jesus and asking Jesus to heal his daughter. And so this is sort of a pretty classically expected start to a Jesus story, right? So a powerful person comes and begs Jesus. It implies that he's, prostrating himself in front of Jesus, okay, in order to ask Jesus to come heal his daughter who is close to death. And Jesus agrees to go. But on the way comes this second story. Along the way comes the story of a woman who is suffering from hemorrhages, and she has been suffering from these hemorrhages for 12 years. Now, the reason why the particulars of her disease are so important is because the hemorrhaging makes her unclean. I mean, remember that when it comes to Jewish law, there is a lot in there about blood. That's why, kosher laws about the slaughtering of animals properly has to do with blood. And so the fact that she is bleeding makes her unclean. And not only is she unclean, but anything she touches is unclean. In fact, just sitting where she sat would render you unclean, and you would have to undergo some rituals in order to be able to fully participate again in the life of the congregation. And so this is something that the listener would have understood. And so this is quite something when she comes up behind Jesus and touches his clothing. Because when she touches him, under Jewish law, Jesus is now unclean. When she touches him, it's basically game over. Because at this point, Jesus should not be going to the house. Jesus is now unclean. Nothing should be able to happen from this point forward. And so this story is told in such a way that the listener who's familiar with these rules would react. The listener would think she is an interloper who has just ruined everything. But then as the story unfolds, what you come to understand is that no, what she's done is that she has acted to claim healing for herself, to claim justice for herself. I mean, she'd been suffering for 12 years. You don't know the fullness of her story, but it implies that very unjust things have been happening to her. Remember, it said that she had been seeking help and the doctors couldn't help, and she was now broke, that she had spent all of her money seeking cures. And so while we don't know the fullness of her story, we do know that for 12 years she has found herself unable to be healed and lost all of her money in the process. And what we also don't know is what she had done to try to see Jesus in a more conventional way. After all, one of the very subtle things in this passage that's easy to overlook is the question of how did the leader of the synagogue get to Jesus? After all, it says that when Jesus came ashore, right, it says that a great crowd gathered around him. Jesus is surrounded by people. Remember when she touches his cloak and says, who touched me? His disciples say, we're surrounded by people. How can you say who touched you? So how did this synagogue leader get to Jesus to be able to fall at his feet and beg him to come help his daughter? I think it's because people probably made way for him. That when he was coming to see Jesus, he may have even had an entourage with him of people who would say, get out of the way, here he comes, make way. And so it's quite possible that he was able to get to Jesus because of his position, because of his power. That the crowds which would not have listened to this woman trying to get to Jesus would have deferentially stepped out of the way for this important man to come to see him. And this is an example of something that persists to this day in our society, and that's that privilege is often unnoticed. We can become so used to the perks of power, to the perks of privilege, that it just seems natural to use it, that no one questions it, that people read this story and they think about the audacity of this woman to come and touch Jesus' clothing, and yet think nothing of the fact that despite the crowds that had gathered around Jesus, this powerful man had been able to get to him seemingly quite easily. No one questions how he got to come face to face with Jesus. He's a powerful leader of the synagogue. Of course he was able to. But she managed to push her way, whatever it took to get there. She managed to sneak up behind Jesus, touch him, receive her healing, and then when Jesus realizes this has happened, he wants to talk to her. And she is afraid. It says she had fear and she had trembling, but she didn't back down. She owned up to exactly what she had done. That after 12 years of not being healed, she found her healing. She claimed her healing. And when she admitted everything to Jesus, he did not get upset. What he said to her is, "Your faith has made you well." See, the listener is kind of led to expect that Jesus is going to be appalled by how brazen she was. But the lesson here is that Jesus is not at all appalled. In fact, Jesus calls her daughter. It's another in many, many, many lessons of the gospel stories that Jesus was assuring her, and in assuring her, assuring us that what he desired was healing. See, she understood him, I think, better than this leader of the synagogue understood Jesus. Why? Because look at what he did. He prostrated himself before Jesus. He begged Jesus to come and heal his daughter. That actually is a bit of a power mindset, isn't it? That he was a powerful person, but he was going to just divest himself of his power. He was going to beg Jesus to help his daughter. But she kind of understood Jesus in a more fundamental way. That Jesus wanted the healing. Jesus wanted to heal her. I think Jairus should have understood that Jesus wanted to heal his daughter. Now, to his credit, when she touches Jesus, when she renders him ritually unclean, and by the way, people probably would have known her. I mean, the towns are not big, people do not travel, and she'd been hemorrhaging for 12 years. And so it's pretty plausible that everyone knew who she was and what her condition was, because they would have known that she shouldn't be in contact with them. They would have known that she shouldn't enter a worship space. They would have known that she was unclean. But when she touches him, he doesn't complain, and that's to his credit. And Jesus is still going to heal, because that's what Jesus wants to do. I mean, that's what Jesus is about. I mean, one of the things that you just don't find anywhere in the Gospels is where there is a good that happens, but Jesus somehow finds a reason to dismiss it. That just really does not happen. And so what happens is, even after after he may have thought that it was over for his daughter, what comes to be is the idea that her gain ended up not being his loss. And he says to the leader, "Do not fear, only believe." And Jesus raises his daughter. Now, in so doing, Jesus breaks all the rules that this person, as a leader of the synagogue, would have wanted to enforce. Jesus goes to his house in this unclean state because the woman touched him. Jesus touches his daughter in an unclean state. Jesus is breaking all of those rules, but it's okay, because what's more important is the healing. What's more important is the good that comes. And that's one of the things we need to stay focused on. We need to remember that when we are told to love your neighbor as yourself, a law which this leader of the synagogue would have known, because that love your neighbor, never forget that love your neighbor as yourself comes out of the Hebrew Scriptures. It is not something invented in the New Testament. And we all need to remember that to love your neighbor as yourself is to want for your neighbor what you would want for yourself. And maybe we can come to understand it better, right? Maybe he came to understand it better if he could come to want for her, to want for this woman what he wanted for his daughter. And it doesn't stop at wanting it. We're called to do justice. And so not only should we want for our neighbors what we want for ourselves, if we are going to be people who do justice, then we need to go out into the world and demand for our neighbors what we would demand for ourselves. We need to claim the healing that is needed and deserved. We need to claim the good. And now, when I say we need to do justice and demand for our neighbors what we want for ourselves, understand that we need to always think of those things in terms of absolute goods. Right? Healing is a good. Being fed is a good. We don't evaluate good by comparing results. It's not a comparison game between us and somebody else. It's simply about good. What is good? And how can we have more good in the world? And sometimes people need to claim it. When the world is denying good to them, the way this woman had been denied healing, had not been able to find it, she finally had to reach out and claim it, and that's something that has to happen in the world. Look at our world right now, at this moment, right? This is the end of Pride Month. And what is that about? It's about persons who've been discriminated against, persons who've been treated unjustly, claiming for themselves the right to the dignity that they deserve. We just enacted Juneteenth as a national holiday after so many years. I mean, I'm very proud of Englewood. Pre-COVID, Englewood, our town, always had a Juneteenth celebration. I was always very proud of that. But every time I would mention it broadly, like on Facebook, I would have so many people who would ask me, what is Juneteenth? And now it's finally a national holiday. And this is a good thing. It's a recognition of the end of something that was so horrible, so awful, which had such long-lasting effects. It's a wonderful thing to celebrate it. And we always need to be allies in the fight for everyone's justice, right? We need to support those who have to claim the justice, claim the healing that they need. We have to support that because it makes the world better. That someone else's gain is not our loss, but rather someone else's gain is everyone's gain. Because ultimately, we're kind of in the same boat. And that point is made very subtly in this passage by a little fact that's given at separate points in the passage. And look at this. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. For 12 years, the woman had been suffering. For 12 years, this little girl was growing up in a privileged household, the beloved daughter of a powerful man. And after 12 years, they landed in the same place. They landed in that place of needing healing from Jesus and receiving it. And it's a good thing for both. So maybe we need to allow these things that our good. We need to have more grace and worry less about what's fair. Because fair is always comparing us to someone else. Maybe we need to worry more about kindness. Maybe we need to worry less about that person who cuts in line because you don't know what's motivating it. Maybe they're in a really legitimate hurry, and yes, they ought to ask. But maybe they were just too distracted to notice. And maybe we can have some grace about that. Because when we do, we make the world a kinder place. When there is justice for someone, when there is healing for someone, when there is kindness for someone, when there is mercy for someone, it lifts us all. Because it's not about their gain versus our loss, but rather it's understanding that every act of kindness raises the bar for everyone. Every act of mercy, every forgiveness isn't costing us, but rather it's raising the bar, raising the expectation that there ought to be more kindness in the world, more mercy in the world, more forgiveness in the world, more grace in the world. And if we can raise that expectation, it raises it not just for others, but for us as well. And the world becomes more of the place that God would have it be. Amen.